Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Terra Nova and watched the stars dance across the view screen. 300 worlds called humans their children now, and each one shined like a jewel in the darkness of space. The year was 2387, and humanity had grown from a single blue planet to an empire that stretched across the galaxy, but Jake knew the secret that made it all possible. One simple rule that every human child learned in school, every soldier swore to follow, and every politician promised to uphold: never harm a sentient species defending their homeworld. That rule had opened doors across the galaxy that would have stayed locked forever without it. The Terra Nova moved through space like a silver needle, carrying Jake and his crew toward the edge of known space. They were explorers, the eyes and ears of humanity, always searching for new worlds and new friends among the stars. Jake had been doing this job for 20 years, and he had never seen anything like what waited for them at Kepler-442b. Dr. Danny Carter rushed onto the bridge, his tablet glowing with data that made his eyes shine with excitement. Danny was the ship's science officer, a man who could look at rocks and tell you stories about worlds that died before humans learned to make fire. Today, those rocks were telling him something incredible. "Captain, you need to see this," Danny sighed, his voice shaking with wonder. "The planet below us is not just alive, it's singing." Jake turned from the view screen to look at his old friend. They had served together on 5 different ships, and Danny had never been one to exaggerate. If he said the planet was singing, then something down there was making music that only science could hear. "Show me," Jake said, and Danny placed his tablet on the captain's chair. The screen filled with waves of color that moved like water, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Each wave represented sound, but not the kind of sound that human ears could hear. This was deeper, richer, like the heartbeat of the planet itself. The entire surface is covered in crystal formations, Danny explained, his finger tracing the patterns on the screen. "But these aren't just rocks, Captain. They're alive. They're thinking, they're talking to each other." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. In all his years of exploration, he had learned that when science officers got excited about living planets, it usually meant they had found something that would change everything. He looked back at the view screen where Kepler-442b hung like a blue-green pearl against the black of space. "Are you telling me we've found a new species?" Jake asked. "Not just a species," Danny replied, "a civilization. The crystals down there have been growing for thousands of years, maybe longer. They've built cities that pulse with light, and they communicate through harmonic frequencies that span the entire planet. Captain, they're more advanced than we are." Jake activated the ship's communication system and called for his senior staff to gather in the briefing room. Within minutes, the room filled with the best minds on the Terra Nova. Commander Lisa Park, his first officer, sat at his right hand. Chief Engineer Carlos Rivera checked the ship's systems one more time before focusing on the meeting. Security Chief Nancy Kim looked worried, as she always did when they found something new. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, "we have discovered something that will make history. Dr. Carter, please brief the team." Danny stood and activated the room's holographic display. The image of Kepler-442b appeared in the center of the table, spinning slowly as data streams flowed around it like digital rain. The planet below us is home to what we're calling the Zephyrians. They're crystalline beings who have built their entire civilization around harmonic resonance. The image changed to show the planet's surface, where cities of living crystal stretched across continents like frozen music. Each structure pulsed with soft light, and the entire planet seemed to breathe with a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. "They don't use technology the way we do," Danny continued. "They are technology. Their bodies are made of the same quantum crystals that power our fastest ships. They grow their cities instead of building them, and they communicate by singing songs that can be heard across the entire world." Commander Park leaned forward in her chair. "Are they hostile?" "No," Danny said quickly. "From what we can tell, they don't even understand the concept of war. They've never had to fight for resources because their planet provides everything they need. They've been living in perfect harmony for millennia. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. First contact with a new species was always delicate, but this was different. The Zephyrians weren't just another alien race. They were something beautiful and pure, something that the galaxy had never seen before. Chief Rivera, Jake said, what's the status of their technology? Carlos looked at his tablet and whistled softly. Captain, they're using quantum manipulation on a scale we can barely understand. Their cities are powered by crystalline networks that tap directly into the planet's core. If we could learn how they do it, we could revolutionize human technology. And the crystals themselves? Jake asked. Pure quantum crystal, Carlos replied. The highest grade we've ever seen. A single city down there contains enough quantum material to power 100 human worlds. Jake felt his heart sink. Quantum crystals were the foundation of human space travel, the fuel that made faster-than-light travel possible. The Federation always needed more crystals, and they were willing to pay any price to get them. But the one rule was clear. If the Zephyrians considered this their homeworld, then humanity could not take anything from them by force. We need to contact Admiral Sullivan, Jake said. This discovery is too important to handle alone. 3 days later, Admiral Kate Sullivan arrived aboard the massive command ship Endeavour. She was a woman who had spent her entire career building bridges between humans and aliens, and she understood the delicate balance that kept the galaxy peaceful. The Galactic Council trusted her, and more importantly, they trusted humanity because of leaders like her. Jake met the Admiral in the Terra Nova's docking bay, where she arrived with a small team of specialists. Dr. Danny Carter was there to brief her on the Zephyrians, and Jake could see the excitement in his eyes. This was the discovery of a lifetime, and Danny wanted to share it with someone who would understand its importance. Captain Morrison, Admiral Sullivan said, her voice warm but professional. I've read your reports. This could be the most significant discovery in human history. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied. But there's something else you need to know. The quantum crystals that make up their cities aren't just technology. According to Dr. Carter, they're sacred to the Zephyrians. They believe the crystals are the bones of their ancestors. Admiral Sullivan's expression grew serious. She understood the implications immediately. If the crystals were sacred, then taking them would be like robbing a graveyard. The one rule existed for exactly this kind of situation. We follow the rule, she said firmly. We make contact, we establish diplomatic relations, and we respect their sovereignty. The Federation has survived for 300 years because we keep our word. Jake felt relief wash over him. He had been worried that someone might try to bend the rule, but Admiral Sullivan was exactly the kind of leader the galaxy needed. She understood that some things were more important than profit, but far away on Earth, other people were reading the same reports, and they were thinking very different thoughts. Corporate Executive Tony Blake of Stellar Mining Consortium looked at the data about Kepler 442b and saw only numbers. Profit margins. Stock prices. Market opportunities. Tony had built his fortune by finding resources that others had missed, and he had never let moral concerns get in the way of a good deal. The one rule was just politics, he thought. Words on paper that could be changed when the situation required it. He reached for his communication device and began making calls to very important people. People who owed him favors. People who understood that sometimes rules had to be broken for the greater good. The galaxy was about to learn that not all humans were as honorable as Jake Morrison and Admiral Sullivan. Some humans were willing to break the one rule that had made them trusted among the stars, and once that rule was broken, nothing would ever be the same. President Helen Martinez stood in the Oval Office of the Presidential Palace on Earth, staring at reports that made her stomach twist with worry. The numbers were clear and brutal. The outer colonies were running out of resources, unemployment was rising across 20 different worlds, and the military was warning about threats from beyond the galaxy. 3 months had passed since Captain Morrison's discovery of the Zephyrians, and the news had spread through every level of government like wildfire. Everyone knew about the quantum crystals on Kepler 442b, and everyone had an opinion about what humanity should do with them. General Ryan Peters walked into the office carrying a folder marked with the highest security classifications. He was a man who had spent 40 years defending human worlds, and the lines on his face told the story of every battle he had fought. Today those lines seemed deeper than ever. "Madam President," he said, placing the folder on her desk, "we have a problem. The Zirithi Empire has been spotted massing fleets near the Andromeda border. Our intelligence suggests they're planning something big." Helen opened the folder and felt her blood run cold. The photographs showed ships unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Massive vessels that looked like they had been grown rather than built, with weapon systems that defied human understanding. The Zirithi were an old enemy, a species that had been quiet for decades but had never forgotten their hatred of human expansion. "How many ships?" she asked. "At least 3,000, Ryan replied. "Maybe more. They're using some kind of stealth technology that makes it hard to get accurate counts. But whatever they're planning, it's going to hit us hard." Helen closed the folder and looked out the window at the city beyond. Earth was beautiful in the morning light, but she could see the problems even from here. Empty buildings where businesses had closed. Protest camps where unemployed workers demanded jobs. News screens that showed angry crowds on colony worlds asking why their government couldn't solve their problems. "What do you need?" she asked. "Resources," Ryan said simply. "The colonies are stretched thin, and our military is running on equipment that's 20 years old. We need quantum crystals to power new ships, new weapons, new defensive systems. Without them, we're sitting ducks." Helen knew what he was asking. The quantum crystals on Kepler 442b could solve all their problems. Enough raw material to build a fleet that could protect humanity for the next century. But there was one problem that made it impossible. "The one rule," she said quietly. "The one rule," Ryan agreed. "But maybe it's time to ask if that rule is still serving humanity's best interests." Before Helen could respond, her secretary announced that corporate executive Tony Blake was waiting to see her. Helen had been expecting this meeting for weeks. Tony was the kind of man who could smell opportunity from across the galaxy, and he had been very busy since the discovery of Kepler-442b. Tony walked into the office like he owned it, his expensive suit and confident smile making him look more like a movie star than a businessman. He carried a briefcase that Helen suspected contained documents that would change everything. "Madam President," Tony said, settling into a chair, without being invited, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about the future of human civilization." Helen remained standing, a subtle reminder that this was her office and her decision to make. "I'm listening." Tony opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet that glowed with charts and graphs. "The Stellar Mining Consortium has been analyzing the economic data from the outer colonies. The situation is worse than the public knows. Without a major influx of resources, we're looking at complete economic collapse within 5 years. He swiped the tablet and showed her unemployment figures. That made her heart sink. Worlds that had been thriving just a decade ago were now ghost towns. Colonial governments were struggling to provide basic services. People were leaving human space entirely, seeking opportunities with alien civilizations that could offer them what their own government could not. "The solution is obvious," Tony continued. "Kepler 442b contains enough quantum crystals to revitalize our entire economy. We could create millions of jobs, fund new colonies, and build the military infrastructure we need to defend ourselves." "The Zephyrians consider those crystals sacred," Helen said. "They're not just resources. They're the bones of their ancestors." Tony's smile never wavered. "That's where you're wrong, Madam President. Our intelligence suggests that the Zephyrians aren't as innocent as they appear." He swiped the tablet again, and Helen found herself looking at surveillance footage that made her blood run cold. The images showed Zephyrian crystal formations pulsing with energy patterns that looked almost like communication signals. But these weren't the peaceful harmonics that Dr. Carter had described. These were harsh, aggressive frequencies that seemed to carry encrypted data. Our analysts believe the Zephyrians are in contact with the Zirathi Empire, Tony said. They're sharing intelligence about human fleet movements, colony defenses, and military capabilities. The peaceful crystal beings are actually enemy spies. Helen stared at the footage, her mind racing. If this was true, then everything changed. The One Rule was designed to protect innocent species, not enemy collaborators. But something about the footage bothered her. It seemed too convenient, too perfect for Tony's argument. "Where did you get this intelligence?" she asked. "Corporate security has assets throughout the galaxy," Tony replied smoothly. "We've been monitoring the situation since Captain Morrison's discovery. The evidence is overwhelming." General Peters leaned forward in his chair. "If the Zephyrians are working with the Zirathi, then they're not defending their homeworld. They're defending an enemy base." Helen felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. 300 worlds depending on her leadership. Millions of people looking to her for protection. An economic crisis that could destroy human civilization. And now evidence that the peaceful Zephyrians might be enemy agents. "I need to consult with Admiral Sullivan," she said. "Admiral Sullivan is a good soldier," Tony said. "But she's not a politician. She doesn't understand the bigger picture. Sometimes leaders have to make hard choices to protect their people." Helen walked to her desk and activated the secure communication system. Within minutes, Admiral Sullivan's image appeared on the screen. She looked tired, as if she had been working around the clock to establish peaceful contact with the Zephyrians. "Admiral," Helen said, "I need your honest assessment of the situation on Kepler 442b. Sullivan's expression grew serious. "The Zephyrians are exactly what they appear to be, Madam President. A peaceful species that has never known war, Dr. Carter. Has been studying their communication patterns, and there's no evidence of hostile intent." "What about contact with the Zirathi?" Helen asked. "None," Sullivan replied firmly. "The Zephyrians don't even have interstellar communication technology. They're a planetary civilization that has never looked beyond their own world." Helen looked at Tony, who was watching the conversation with an expression that seemed almost amused. "Are you certain, Admiral?" "Absolutely," Sullivan said. "The intelligence suggesting Zephyrian-Zirathi collaboration is fabricated. Someone is trying to manipulate this situation for their own gain." Tony stood up smoothly, his briefcase already closed. "Admiral Sullivan has been compromised by extended contact with the aliens. Her judgment can no longer be trusted." "That's enough," Helen said, but Tony was already walking toward the door. "You have 24 hours to make a decision, Madam President," he said. "After that, the economic situation will deteriorate beyond repair. And when the Zirathi attack, the blood of every human who dies will be on your hands." He left the office, and Helen was alone with General Peters and the image of Admiral Sullivan on the screen. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that could swallow everything humanity had built. "The evidence could be fabricated," Helen said finally. "It could be," Peters agreed. "But can we afford to take that risk? If the Zirathi attack, and we're not prepared, it won't matter who was right about the Zephyrians." Helen looked at the reports scattered across her desk. Economic collapse, military weakness, an enemy fleet massing at the borders. And on a distant world, a species of crystal beings who sang songs that could be heard across the stars, completely unaware that their fate was being decided by politicians who had never seen their beautiful cities. "Give me 12 hours, she said. "I need to think." But even as she spoke, Helen knew that the decision had already been made. The pressure was too great, the stakes too high, and the fear too real. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear the one rule that had guided humanity for 3 centuries: never harm a sentient species defending their homeworld. Tomorrow, she would have to decide if that rule was worth more than human survival. And deep in her heart, she already knew what her answer would be. President Helen Martinez stood before the emergency session of the Colonial Senate, her hands shaking as she held the authorization document that would change everything. The great hall was packed with senators from across human space, their faces showing the strain of the impossible choice they were about to make. Senator Lisa Adams rose from her seat in the front row, her voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years in politics. The evidence presented by the Stellar Mining Consortium is clear. The Zephyrians represent a direct threat to human security through their collaboration with the Zirathi Empire. The chamber erupted in debate as senators argued back and forth about the intelligence reports. Some called for caution, others demanded immediate action. But Helen could see the fear in their eyes. The same fear that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. The fear that if they did nothing, humanity would pay the price in blood. Dr. Danny Carter burst through the chamber doors, his face flushed with desperation. He had been trying to reach the president for hours, but security had kept him away. Now he stood in the gallery, shouting over the noise of the debate. "The intelligence is fake," he yelled. "The Zephyrians don't have the technology to communicate with the Zirathi. Their harmonic frequencies can't even reach beyond their own atmosphere." Senator Adams looked up at him with cold eyes. "Dr. Carter, your emotional attachment to the aliens has compromised your scientific judgment. The security of 300 human worlds cannot be left to the opinions of one scientist." Danny tried to push past the security guards, but they held him back. "You're making a terrible mistake. The Zephyrians are peaceful. They've never hurt anyone. They don't even understand what war means." "That's exactly what makes them dangerous," Senator Adams replied. "A species that claims to be peaceful while secretly working with our enemies is the worst kind of threat." Helen watched the debate with growing horror. She had seen the real intelligence reports, the ones that Admiral Sullivan had sent directly to her private channel. The evidence against the Zephyrians was indeed fabricated, created by corporate interests who wanted access to the quantum crystals. But the economic crisis was real, and the Zirathi threat was real, and the pressure from every corner of human space was becoming unbearable. General Peters stood at the podium, his uniform covered with medals from decades of service. Operation Crystal Dawn has been planned as a limited military action to secure the quantum crystal deposits on Kepler 442b. Our forces will minimize casualties and focus on strategic objectives. "What about the civilians?" asked Senator Robert Hayes from the colony world of New Boston. "The cities are inhabited by millions of Zephyrians. Intelligence suggests that the civilian population is actually a military force in disguise," Peters replied. "The crystalline beings can reconfigure their bodies into weapons at will. There are no true civilians on Kepler 442b. Helen closed her eyes, knowing that this was another lie. The Zephyrians were as peaceful as Dr. Carter claimed, but the lie was necessary to make the senators feel better about what they were about to do. Sometimes leaders had to tell lies to protect people from the truth. Captain Jake Morrison sat in a detention cell aboard the Terra Nova, his hands cuffed behind his back. He had refused to participate in Operation Crystal Dawn, and military police had arrested him for insubordination. Through the small window of his cell, he could see the massive fleet that had assembled around Kepler-442b. Colonel Brad Stevens now commanded the operation, a man who had never questioned an order in his 30-year career. He stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Manifest Destiny, watching the planet below through the viewscreen. The crystal cities pulsed with gentle light, their beauty visible even from orbit. "All units, this is command," Stevens said into his headset. "Operation Crystal Dawn is authorized. Begin orbital bombardment of primary targets." The first missiles struck the largest crystal city just as the sun rose over the planet's surface. The explosion sent shockwaves through the crystalline network, and the harmonic frequencies that had sung for thousands of years suddenly turned into screams of pain and terror. The Zephyrians had no weapons, no shields, no way to defend themselves against the rain of fire that fell from the sky. They tried to communicate with the human ships, sending harmonic pleas for understanding. But the military had been told that these sounds were actually battle cries. Dr. Carter broke free from his guards and ran to the communication station, desperately trying to translate the Zephyrian harmonics. "They're not fighting back," he screamed. They're asking why we're hurting them. They're begging us to stop. Colonel Stevens looked at the scientist with disgust. The enemy is using psychological warfare. Don't listen to their tricks. The bombardment continued for 3 days and nights. Crystal cities that had grown for millennia were reduced to rubble in hours. The harmonic network that connected the entire planet began to fail as crucial nodes were destroyed. The songs that had filled the world with music for countless generations fell silent one by one on the third day. The last major city sent out a final transmission before the bombs fell. Dr. Carter was still at the communication station, tears streaming down his face as he translated the message for anyone who would listen. "They're saying goodbye," he whispered. "They're telling their children that they love them. They're asking their ancestors to forgive them for failing to protect their world." The city died in a flash of light that could be seen from space. The crystal network that had taken millions of years to grow was shattered beyond repair. The Zephyrians who survived the bombardment wandered through the ruins of their civilization, their harmonic voices broken and full of grief. News of the attack spread across the galaxy faster than human ships could travel. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session on Nexus Prime, where representatives from 47 different species gathered to discuss what humanity had done. Ambassador Liu Wei stood before the council, his face pale with shame. He had spent his entire career building trust between humans and aliens, and now he watched that trust crumble in real time. "The Terran Federation regrets the necessity of this action," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But intelligence indicated that the Zephyrians posed a direct threat to human security. The Mindari representative, a being of pure thought who communicated through telepathy, projected waves of disgust that filled the chamber. "We have scanned the human mind. That stands before us. The intelligence was fabricated. Your species has committed genocide for profit." The Craxi ambassador, a warrior poet whose people had fought alongside humans for decades, removed his ceremonial weapon and placed it on the floor. "The Craxi withdraw all military support from the Terran Federation. We will not serve alongside murderers." One by one, the representatives of the galactic community stood and walked out of the chamber, leaving Ambassador Liu Wei alone with his shame. In 3 days, humanity had destroyed 3 centuries of trust and turned every species in the galaxy into an enemy. On Kepler 442b, Colonel Stevens walked through the ruins of the Crystal City, his boots crunching on fragments that had once been living beings. The quantum crystals that corporate interests had wanted so badly were scattered across the landscape, but something was wrong with them. They no longer pulsed with clean energy. Instead, they flickered with dark patterns that hurt to look at. "Sir," one of his soldiers reported, "the mining equipment is malfunctioning. The crystals are emitting some kind of interference that's driving the machinery crazy." Stevens picked up a piece of crystal and felt it vibrate against his palm. The harmonic frequency was different now, tainted with something that made his teeth ache. "Get the mining crews down here anyway. We didn't come this far to go home empty-handed." But the crystals had been changed by what happened to them. They remembered the songs of the Zephyrians, the pain of their death, and the betrayal of a species that had claimed to be peaceful. The quantum energy that had once powered beautiful cities now carried the echo of genocide, and anyone who tried to use it would carry that echo with them. Captain Morrison finally received word that he was being released from detention. As he walked through the corridors of the Terra Nova, he could see the guilt in the eyes of every crew member he passed. They had all been part of this, willing or not, and they would carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives. He reached his quarters and activated his personal communication system, sending a message to every human ship in the fleet. "This is Captain Morrison. What we have done here today will haunt us forever. We broke the one rule that made us trusted among the stars, and we did it for lies and profit. History will judge us harshly, but we still have time to do the right thing." The message was intercepted by military sensors, but not before it reached hundreds of ships. Some of the crew members began to question their orders. Others started to organize resistance movements. The seeds of rebellion were planted in the very moment of humanity's greatest military victory. On Earth, President Martinez received the reports of the successful operation with a heavy heart. The quantum crystals were secured, the economic crisis would be solved, and the military would have the resources it needed to defend against the Zirathi threat. The first colony to fall was New Texas, a farming world on the edge of human space where 3 million people grew food for the inner systems. The attack came without warning, just 6 months after the massacre on Kepler 442b. Zirathi bioships appeared in the system like a plague of locusts, their organic hulls pulsing with weapons that turned the planet's atmosphere into poison. Governor Sam Rodriguez stood in the emergency bunker beneath the capital city, watching the screens as his world died around him. The same Sam Rodriguez who had helped corporate executive Tony Blake convince the Senate to authorize the attack on the Zephyrians. Now he was paying the price for his greed. "The orbital defense platforms are down," reported Colonel Nancy Wilson, the planet's military commander. "The Zirathi are using some kind of weapon we've never seen before. It's like they know exactly where our weak points are." Sam stared at the tactical display, his face pale with understanding. The Zirathi had been planning this attack for months, maybe years. They had waited for humanity to break the one rule, waited for the galaxy to turn against them, and then struck at the moment when humans had no allies left to call for help. "Send a distress signal to Earth," he ordered. "Already tried, Nancy," replied. "The Zirathi are jamming all communications. We're on our own." Above them, the bioships released clouds of spores that settled on the planet's surface like snow. Within hours, the crops that had fed dozens of human worlds began to wither and die. The people who breathed the contaminated air started to change, their bodies twisted by alien biology into something that was no longer human. The last transmission from New Texas was a desperate message from Governor Rodriguez himself. "This is what we get for breaking our word. The galaxy is watching us burn, and nobody is coming to help us." On Earth, President Helen Martinez watched the reports from New Texas with growing horror. The Zirathi attack was unlike anything in human military history. They weren't just conquering the planet. They were erasing it, turning it into something alien and hostile that could never support human life again. General Ryan Peters stood beside her in the war room, his face grim with the knowledge that his worst fears were coming true. "The Zirathi have been planning this for decades. They waited for us to isolate ourselves, and now they're striking at our most vulnerable colonies. What about our allies?" Helen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Gone," Ryan replied. "The Mandari have closed their borders to human ships. The Craxi are actively helping the Zirathi by sharing intelligence about our military capabilities. Even the peaceful gardener species have refused our requests for assistance." Helen activated the communication system and tried to reach Ambassador Liu Wei on Nexus Prime. The connection was weak and filled with static, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes when his image appeared on the screen. "Ambassador, we need help," she said. "The Zirathi are destroying our colonies, and we can't stop them alone." Liu Wei shook his head sadly. "Madam President, I've spent the last 6 months trying to rebuild trust with the galactic community. Every species I talk to gives me the same answer. Humanity broke the one rule, and now they must face the consequences alone." "But innocent people are dying," Helen protested. "Innocent people died on Kepler 442b2, Liu Wei replied. "The difference is that the Zephyrians never hurt anyone. They died for the crime of existing in a place where humans wanted their resources." The connection cut out, leaving Helen alone with the weight of her decisions. She had authorized the attack on the Zephyrians to protect humanity, but instead she had doomed her own species to fight a war they could not win. Captain Jake Morrison had been released from military custody, but his career was over. He now led a growing resistance movement of humans who refused to accept what their government had done. His followers included scientists, military officers, and ordinary citizens who believed that humanity could still find a path to redemption. They had established a secret base on the asteroid mining station Ceres, where they provided aid to Zephyrian refugees and tried to expose the lies that had led to the massacre. Dr. Danny Carter worked alongside them, using his scientific knowledge to help the surviving Zephyrians rebuild their shattered communities. "The quantum crystals are still singing," Danny told Morrison as they watched a group of Zephyrian survivors working to grow new crystal formations. "But the songs are different now. They're full of pain and loss, and they remember what was done." To them, Morrison nodded, understanding the implications. The crystals that humanity had stolen were tainted with the memory of genocide. Every ship that used them, every machine that was powered by them, carried the echo of what had been done on Kepler 442b. "Can they be healed?" he asked. "Maybe," Danny replied. "But it would require a sacrifice that I'm not sure any human is willing to make. The crystals remember everything, and they won't forget until justice is served." Meanwhile, the war with the Zirathi continued to spread across human space. The colony world of Eden Prime fell next, its beautiful cities reduced to ash by orbital bombardment. The mining stations in the asteroid belt were overrun by Zirathi ground forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. Admiral Kate Sullivan, her fleet reduced to just 12 ships, made a desperate last stand at the Battle of Proxima Centauri. She had once been humanity's greatest hero, the woman who had built bridges between species and maintained the peace for decades. Now she was fighting a losing battle against enemies who had once been friends. "All ships, this is Admiral Sullivan," she broadcast on the open channel. "We cannot win this battle, but we can give the civilian transports time to escape. For humanity, for the future, for the hope that our children might be better than we were." The battle lasted 18 hours. Sullivan's ships fought with desperate courage, holding off a Zirathi fleet 10 times their size. One by one, the human ships were destroyed, their crews dying far from home in a war that should never have been fought. Admiral Sullivan's flagship was the last to fall. As the ship broke apart around her, she sent a final message to Earth. "We fought well, but we fought for the wrong reasons. Tell the people that we could have been better. Tell them that the one role was worth more than all the quantum crystals in the galaxy." The Zirathi victory at Proxima Centauri opened the way to Earth itself. Within days, alien fleets were assembling at the edge of the solar system, preparing for the final assault on humanity's homeworld. On Earth, civil war had broken out between different factions of humans. Morrison's resistance movement battled government forces in the streets of major cities. Corporate executive Tony Blake, whose lies had started the whole catastrophe, was found dead in his office, killed by his own security forces when they learned the truth about what he had done. The quantum crystals from Kepler 442b had been distributed throughout human space, powering ships and weapons and industrial facilities. But everywhere they were used, strange things began to happen. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Workers reported hearing voices in languages they didn't understand. The crystals themselves began to glow with patterns that hurt to look at. Dr. Carter had been studying the phenomenon, and his findings were terrifying. "The crystals are alive," he told Morrison during a secret meeting in the ruins of New York. "They're not just remembering what happened to the Zephyrians. They're actively trying to communicate with something." "With what?" Morrison asked. "I think they're calling to other crystalline species across the galaxy. The Zephyrians weren't the only ones. There are crystal beings on dozens of worlds, and they're all connected through quantum resonance. When we destroyed Kepler 442b, we sent a message of pain and betrayal to every crystal species in the galaxy." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying we've made enemies of species we've never even met?" "I'm saying we've made enemies of species we didn't even know existed," Carter replied. "And they're coming." The first crystal ships appeared in human space just as the Zirathi began their final assault on Earth. These were vessels unlike anything in the galaxy, grown rather than built, powered by the same quantum resonance that had once made the Zephyrian cities sing with beauty. But there was no beauty in these ships. They pulsed with dark energy, their crystalline hulls reflecting the pain and anger of species that had felt the death of their cousins on Kepler 442. B. They moved through space like living things, hunting for the humans who had committed genocide against their kind. The crystal ships didn't fight alongside the Zerathi. They didn't need to. They simply appeared wherever human forces were strongest and began to sing. The same harmonic frequencies that had once been used for communication now became weapons, shattering human ships from the inside out. General Peters stood in the command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, watching as humanity's last defenses crumbled. The quantum crystals that powered their weapons were turning against them, resonating with the crystal ships and causing massive system failures. "Sir," reported his aide, "we're getting reports of equipment failures across the entire fleet. The quantum crystals are destabilizing." Peters understood what was happening. The crystals remembered their origin, remembered the peaceful beings who had grown them with love and care. Now they were returning to their source. 50 years had passed since the fall of humanity's empire, and the galaxy had learned to live without them. The great cities of Earth lay in ruins, overgrown with vines and slowly returning to nature. The 300 worlds that had once called themselves human were now empty monuments to a civilization that had chosen greed over honor. Jake Morrison was an old man now, his hair white as snow and his hands shaking with age. He sat on the porch of his small house on the world of Haven, watching his great-grandson Pete play in the garden. Haven was one of the few places where humans were still welcome, protected by the gardener species who believed that even the worst mistakes could be forgiven with time and genuine repentance. Pete was 12 years old, the same age Jake had been when he first dreamed of exploring the stars. But Pete's dreams were different. He had grown up knowing that humans were outcasts, that their ancestors had committed a crime so terrible that the galaxy would never forget it. "Grandpa Jake," Pete said, sitting down beside the old man, "why do the other kids at school treat me different? They say humans are bad people." Jake felt his heart break a little more, the way it did every time he had to explain to a new generation why they lived in exile. "A long time ago, our people made a terrible mistake. We hurt innocent beings who had never done anything wrong to us." "But why?" Pete asked, his young face full of confusion. "Why would we hurt innocent people?" Jake looked out at the alien landscape of Haven, where crystalline trees grew in patterns that reminded him of the Zephyrian cities he had seen so long ago. "Because we were afraid and greedy. We thought that getting what we wanted was more important than doing what was right." "Can't we say sorry?" Pete asked. "Can't we make it better?" Jake smiled sadly at his great-grandson's innocence. "Some things can't be fixed with sorry, Pete. Some mistakes are so big that they change everything forever." In the ruins of the old presidential palace on Earth, President Maria Santos worked by candlelight in an office that had once commanded 300 worlds. Now she governed the remnants of humanity on Earth and a handful of nearby systems, always under the watchful eyes of alien peacekeepers who made sure humans never again posed a threat to galactic peace. Maria had been born after the fall, raised on stories of the great human empire that had once spread across the stars. She had dedicated her life to keeping the memory of that empire alive, but also to ensuring that humanity never forgot the lesson of their downfall. "The supply ships from Alpha Centauri are 3 days late," reported her aide, a young woman named Carol Blake, who bore the same last name as the corporate executive whose lies had started the whole catastrophe. Carol carried that name like a burden, a reminder of what greed could do to an entire species. "The Zerathi are probably inspecting them again," Maria replied. "They still don't trust us to govern ourselves." The Zerathi Empire had grown strong. In the years since humanity's fall, claiming many of the worlds that humans had once called home, they ruled with iron discipline, turning former human colonies into fortress worlds designed to prevent any species from ever again threatening galactic peace. But the Zerathi were not the only ones who had benefited from humanity's collapse. The crystal species that had answered the call of the dying Zephyrians had formed their own alliance, a network of worlds connected by quantum resonance that spanned half the galaxy. They called themselves the Harmonic Collective, and they had become the galaxy's conscience. ensuring that no species would ever again commit genocide in the name of progress. Dr. Danny Carter was 93 years old now, one of the few humans who had witnessed both the rise and fall of their empire. He worked in a small laboratory on the outskirts of New Geneva, still trying to understand the quantum crystals that had once powered human civilization. His research had taken on new meaning in recent years. The crystals that had been stolen from Kepler 442b were still scattered across human space, but they had changed. They no longer provided the clean energy that had once made faster-than-light travel possible. Instead, they pulsed with dark harmonics that seemed to carry the pain and anger of the Zephyrians who had died. "The crystals are trying to tell us something," Danny told his assistant, a young human named Steve Wilson, whose grandfather had been a military officer during the war. "They're not just remembering what happened. They're actively trying to communicate with us." Steve looked at the readings on his tablet, his face pale with understanding. "What are they trying to say?" "I think they're offering us a choice," Danny replied. "The same choice we should have made 50 years ago. The choice between taking what we want and doing what's right." On the distant world of Kepler 442b, something impossible was happening. The crystal formations that had been shattered by human bombs were beginning to grow again. Not quickly, not easily, but with a patience that only crystalline beings could possess. The few Zephyrians who had survived the massacre had spent decades tending to the broken remains of their world, singing the old songs and trying to heal the wounds that humanity had inflicted. They had been joined by members of other crystal species, beings who had traveled across the galaxy to help rebuild what had been destroyed, but these new crystals were different from the ones that had been destroyed. They pulsed with darker colors, their harmonics carrying undertones of pain and loss that had never existed in the original Zephyrian songs. They remembered what had been done to them, and they would never let the galaxy forget. The leader of the rebuilding effort was an ancient Zephyrian named Resonance of Deep Waters, one of the few who had been alive when the human ships first arrived. She had watched her people die, had seen their beautiful cities reduced to rubble, and had spent 50 years trying to understand why it had happened. "The humans came to us with words of peace," she sang to the other crystal beings who worked alongside her. "They said they wished to learn from us, to share knowledge and understanding. But their hearts were full of greed and their words were lies." Another crystal being, one from the distant world of Prism, harmonized with her song. "Should we not forgive them? They were young as a species, and young beings make mistakes." "Some mistakes cannot be forgiven," Resonance of Deep Waters replied. "They knew we were peaceful. They knew we had never harmed anyone. They killed us anyway because they wanted what we had." The conversation was carried across the quantum network that connected all crystal beings, and the consensus was clear. Humanity had been judged and found wanting. They would be allowed to survive, but only as a warning to other species about the price of breaking the fundamental laws of galactic civilization. Back on Earth, Dr. Carter made a discovery that changed everything. The quantum crystals in his laboratory had begun to resonate with something far away, something that felt familiar and yet alien at the same time. "Steve," he called to his assistant, "come look at this." The young man hurried over to the monitoring station, where the crystals were displaying patterns of light that seemed almost like language. "What is it, Doctor?" "I think it's a message," Carter replied. "The crystals are connected to something on Kepler 442b. The Zephyrians are trying to communicate with us. They worked through the night, using every piece of equipment in the laboratory to decode the harmonic patterns. Finally, as the sun rose over the ruins of Earth, they heard a voice that had been silent for 50 years. "We forgive you," the voice said, carried across the galaxy by quantum resonance. "But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. We remember what you did, and we will ensure that the galaxy remembers too." Carter felt tears running down his face as he realized what the message meant. The Zephyrians were offering humanity a chance at redemption, but it would come at a price that few humans would be willing to pay. "What do they want?" Steve asked. "They want us to remember," Carter replied. They want us to carry the guilt of what we did, to teach our children about the price of greed and fear. They want us to become living reminders of what happens when a species abandons its moral foundation. The message continued, and Carter translated it for his assistant. They're offering to restore some of the quantum crystals to give us limited access to faster-than-light travel. But only if we agree to certain conditions. What conditions? Steve asked. We must never again claim sovereignty over any world. We must never build weapons of mass destruction. We must never govern any species other than ourselves. And we must tell the story of what we did to every generation so that humanity never forgets the price of breaking the one rule. It was a harsh bargain, but it was more than humanity deserved. They would survive, but as a diminished species, forever marked by the shame of what they had done. Their children would grow up knowing that their ancestors had been capable of genocide, and that knowledge would shape every decision they made. President Santos received the message from Dr. Carter with a mixture of hope and despair. The Zephyrians were offering humanity a path back to the stars, but it was a path that would require them to accept permanent exile from the community of civilized species. We accept, she said, her voice carrying across the ruins of Earth to the few humans who were still listening. We accept the judgment of those we wronged, and we promise to remember what we did. The galaxy listened to her words and nodded in satisfaction.